So my background is in the sciences and in statistics and that sort of analytical world. I joined a sort of a mid-level environmental and engineering firm when I left school, amidst all the the little jobs you do there. And I was there for about a dozen years. Through the first two acquisitions there were pretty non-event. And then the third one, that one hurt a little bit. It went very large, very corporate, with all the sort of trappings that make people crazy about corporate life. And I was working really, really hard, and to the point that I ended up sort of making myself sick. And that was sort of the launch to think about how things might be different. But yeah, up until then I was operating as a biologist and then a manager, and managing then multiple departments and then in multiple locations and multiple states. And so it was a very good education for how to ultimately, kind of operate on my own. And in fact, the company that ultimately acquired us, that was so challenging, was giving us, they pick out a few of us to send overseas and do entrepreneurial training. And I kept in touch with a few people, and a shocking number of people in that group ended up leaving and starting their own business. We were supposed to come back in and infuse the business, but the barriers were too much.
Yes.
So so fast forward, that illness put me out for about a month and a half, and after the first couple weeks of Vicodin on the couch, I was ready to kind of figure out, what was working, how could I do this differently. Laboratories, biology, you can't exactly just, hop on down to Starbucks and do your thing. You have to have space and leases and equipment, and there's a lot of infrastructure to it and capital and things like that. So I talked to a lot of friends about, how I could do it in my way and be nimble. So I went back after my recovery, after being on disability, so it wasn't sort of a conflict issue. And I made an offer to buy out my departments, with the support of all the money out in my house, and then also a couple of friends who invested, who were willing to invest. And they patted me on the head and sent me back to my office and said, "What are you, crazy?" And I said, "No, really. I think it's do this. I could do it, take everything with me and do it kind of the easy way, or I can start from scratch, but I'm prepared to do it." So the sort of embrace of the plan B potential made the negotiations for me much easier, because I knew I was going either way. So I didn't have as much sort of emotion around getting them to sell me the departments. But they were so risk averse, I knew they probably would anyway, because they didn't have anybody really to run the thing. They went to all my employees and asked at the time, and everybody was like, "This isn't so fun." It was a lot of heavy-handed corporates. So anyway, so that's how I ended up deciding to start. I felt like if everything went wrong, I was still pretty young. I was in my early 30s. I have a varied skill set. I could do stuff. So I wasn't too, maybe that's ridiculous, but I wasn't.
No, I think it's great.
I'm naturally very change embracing. I don't have a lot of fears around change. So for whatever.
Awesome. So talk about kind of the early years of the business. You do your Jerry Maguire and you say, "Follow me."
Yeah, which is fun.
Yes, I can imagine.
Yeah.
So talk about the early years of the growth of the business, all those employees that came with you. Did they stay? How did you grow the business? All that good stuff.
Right. So initially, I think it was 19 people came with me. So I started with a decent little crowd, and I took over the operations both in Washington State, my whole branch, which was Washington State and San Diego in California. I was a little bit perhaps overzealous on the growth front. That would be one cautionary thing I might mention for folks. I ended up opening, within the States in Los Angeles, and I ended up somehow with 5 leases, and I opened within the year, I opened a second company in Canada as an independent company, not as a branch for tax, reasons and all that. So we pretty quickly, within a few years, we had quite a lot going on. We had grown substantially and sort of doubled staff and locations and all that kind of stuff. So I don't necessarily, I think when you get to that point, you have to start looking at it and think of, if there are going to be hard decisions to make, it's good to do those as quickly as possible. I was not as quick to do that. I was probably a little bit too married to some of the expansion decisions. I did it across markets, across sectors, across geography. I probably did a little bit too much. So, but those were exciting and dangerous years. Well, the business was in environmental laboratory testing. So we tested across a variety of materials across all over the world, from all over the world. We did sediment work in Hong Kong, and we did product testing out of Belgium, and all kinds of stuff. But the core function was always testing a material to see what the impacts on the environment would be and what decisions would need to be made from either a regulatory licensure sort of execution decision about what verb could happen. Could they build something? Could they distribute something? Could they ship it? Could they dispose of it a certain way? It was somebody needed to take an action, and they needed a decision-making framework based on the science. And we served all across ports and harbors and oil and gas and NGOs. We worked for ExxonMobil, and we also worked for Coastkeeper. My positioning for us was always around you're trying to develop the answer. First, you're asking the right question, and then you're trying to develop answers to those questions so that you can make decisions that you want to make. The decisions you made were not I was not in an advocacy role. I was trying to provide the basis for people to decide how they should proceed, whether their motivation was to build a pipeline or to protest against the pipeline. We were sort of a bit of a neutral scientific body.
At what point in the business did you start to think, what's next?
Yeah. I wish somebody had told me maybe to start with the end of it. That it is important that you realize that you may get to one day when you realize that you're the only one who can't quit. Most days you don't want to, but the proportion starts to shift. And so, yeah, I did not. But I would say when I got to roughly the 10-year mark, I started getting a little restless about the systems and the structures and the things we were needing to build were much more programmatic. I like the sort of early phase creative, that speaks to my sort of way of thinking better. I'm a very kind of, I like optionality. I like thinking about all the different ways that things could fit together. And when you start to get to the point of building HR systems and legal systems, things like that, it wasn't as much fun for me. At the same time, my mom got diagnosed with Alzheimer's. She started worsening. I started getting pulled very dramatically in different directions. That started being hard. And so I sought out the counsel of, again, a couple of friends. The aspects of having a sort of deep bench of relationships, I don't think can be overstated. There are moments in the company's history where I couldn't make payroll. I had to borrow money from people. There are moments where there's all kinds of reasons that you need people's consult that are outside the business, and those relationships are really important. I started to, I interviewed I started realizing that I really was going to take it to market then. And I needed to exit in a way that I could help with my mom and do some things. So I spoke with a couple of kind of classic broker types. Not super impressed with the folks in that realm, I have to say.
Yeah, I've heard that quite a bit.
Yeah, so I called a friend who had built a small lab into a huge lab and sold it to a big multinational conglomerate. And I called him to say, who helped you? Because these guys seem really awful. And they don't have a value set I have in terms of the business of the people. In fact, they don't care about the people at all. And he said, oh, I have a nonprofit. If you kick in half of what you were going to give those guys to my nonprofit, I'll help you through the process, because he'd been through it now every which way. And that was terrific. He helped me just with the kind of arm's length that you needed to put things together, take a hard look at it, go to market. We identified about 12 groups that we thought would be a good match to fill the gaps, as I said, of things that we thought my company was called Nautilus, that Nautilus needed to go to the next level, and for people to have opportunities to move forward, and for me to be able to step back, that they had enough knowledge and infrastructure of what we did specifically for me to be able to step back. So we went out to 12, we did 6 tours. I got 4 offers, which was great. And I chose, I think it was the second highest one. I chose based on the whole picture of what they were willing to do with the company, what stage they were in, how it fit into their structure, how big they were, what my role would be, all that. It wasn't, so lots of things go into that.
You mean they don't just hand you money and let you sail off into the sunset, Marilyn?
Sadly, no. I'm still consulting to them, actually. So I'm still waiting for the sunset.
So talk about a little bit, as much as you can share, Marilyn, the negotiation process with this company. You made a decision. Was it as simple as, here's the number, here's the deal, go? Was there a lot of back and forth? How did that work?
Yeah, there was a lot of back and forth. They had a third-party firm doing due diligence, which was challenging. And I guess, one piece of advice is to push back a little bit if you feel like people are just being a little bit ridiculous in terms of, because it's often not the group that you're working with, it's their consultants trying to sort of prove their own value. So you have to remember the lens through which people are doing their role in that. But yeah, it took a while, and then they had, we had a letter of intent signed. We were moving forward, and then the other company had a CEO change, and everything got put on hold. And I thought,
oh no! How many months into this was that?
It was, I think we had the LOI. Went out to, I think it was maybe October. We got the LOI. We were doing everything, and then they had a CEO change in December. And so then everything got basically stuck in the weeds for a few months to like March. And then they wanted to do due diligence all over again.
Oh no.
And then there's a whole series of things that you learn, like if you have your company name as an owner operator on a building that you bought to operate in, your SBA loan has to release to be able to close, because they won't put their name on. There's a lot of like little weedy lessons that are important and can muck things up. But ultimately, we didn't close then. So we had an LOI in October. We didn't close until July 31. But we closed 12 years to the day I started July 31st of 2004, and we closed July 31st of 2016. And it was the weirdest day. I was up, because people were in the East Coast. I was up at 6 a.m. with my lawyer and my accountant doing the final, funds flow and the final closing and the signatures. And it was the same day, because it was the last day of the month, it was the same day that we had to move my mom from her independent care to a memory care. My husband took the day off, and he moved her. And we didn't even, people were like, are you going to celebrate? It's like, no, I can't. We've got to get my mother, who's, just so unhappy, like settled. Like this was that day is like a little microcosm of the whole thing.
I can only imagine. My goodness. Wow.
All's well that ends well.
Yes. I assume maybe shortly thereafter you did celebrate?
Yes. I think we did like just open a bottle. We don't even know if we had dinner. We just like opened a bottle of champagne or something.
Wow. And as that feeling set in, and I know they, kept you on, with the company to continue to support, but as that feeling set in, maybe days or weeks after, what was that feeling like, Marilyn?
very freeing. You know, I could feel some of my creativity coming back. Theirs was the only offer that didn't require me to sign on for a certain period of time. And in fact, the initial weeks, you know, are spent in transition and all kinds of just weeds that you don't really think of. You think you're just going to, like, you know, toss your keys and walk out the door. That's generally speaking, not exactly how it works. So there is a lot of transitional accounting and things like that. But they were fine with me kind of just backing off for, it was 6 months before I actually went back and took a role. Mm-hmm. I didn't actually come back and take a role with them until the following February, after, you know, months of really focusing on my mom and all that. So it was a big relief at that point, because because of the sort of conflicting priorities and limited time of that moment. But yeah, it was very freeing.
Good. And question about when you did come back 6 months later, what did that feel like? You're like walking into your own house that's not yours anymore,
yeah,
right?
It's funny. And in fact, I still have an office in the building, and I still own the building, which is, a really good idea if people can
Good job.
make
Good
that
job.
work. So I still have a little office there, but yeah, it was odd, but I came back in two roles, one in both very narrowly scoped. And I got good advice from other folks who had exited and stayed with the same company that I knew, to say, just remember, you offer your advice, but it's no longer, you know, that's their decision. You can give your best advice, and then don't think, oh, they should be doing this or should be doing, you know. It's their company, they'll do what they do. I haven't had the attachment. I think that I have friends who have gone through this and have a real, they feel like it's their baby. I was ready to do this, and I was good from day one. And the two roles I got were really interesting to do. One was to help mentor the next group of folks that I had hired that to fulfill roles that I had been fulfilling, that they would take over. So that was good. That was sort of just a teaching, mentoring kind of thing, which this is a part I'm still doing, and apparently very slowly. And then the other role that I had with them was to move into corporate M&A, mergers and acquisitions role, to identify and advise and evaluate other companies that were looking to join the family. So that was actually quite nice for me, because it was brand new, and it put me back in that early stage kind of creative, looking at and hearing everybody, the arc of all those people's stories of how they started, and often then for 40 years we're still operating the same companies from the time that the Clean Water Act was passed in the 70s, and now these men and women were in their 60s and 70s, had been doing this a whole lifetime career. So it was really interesting and varied, which is important to me. I like a lot of variety. If you do have an operation, if you do have the opportunity to purchase a piece of property or a building while you're an owner operator, and you can take advantage of the tremendous SBA facilities for that, and the tax breaks of it, and paying yourself rent and being able to control the finances, you know, from sort of both ends of that. It's a really big advantage financially in the long term. And some people say you shouldn't do that if you're planning to sell, because some people may or may not want the building. I wouldn't let that stop you from doing that, because it's just such a good long-term proposition, and it just comes with so many tremendous advantages. So I'm a big proponent of that. The timing is so important to a good outcome, to be able to choose when you want to exit, to sell when you want to sell, and not because you have to sell. And a company that is ready to sell all the time is a really well operating company. You know, the books are clean, they're up to date, it's profitable. Even if it's not profitable, it's clear what's happening. The decision making, the structures, the operational guidelines are clear. If you operate your company as if you were planning to sell it as a baseline, then that's the best decision you can make before you sell, to make it as painless as possible. And you have the added bonus of it being a really well operating company, because it just helps you clean up all the stuff that you wouldn't want, you know, to have to deal with in that moment. So it wasn't really a decision. We were always pretty good about keeping things professional and up to date. And I think that's because I came from a big corporation, and you had an accounting close every month, and I just kept on doing that because I had done it for so long. And so the other thing is keeping a sense of the business as a constituency that you're working with. So when going through the sale, or just always managing the company, but also going through the sale particularly, I always thought of it as sort of three legs of the stool that kept the thing operating. We had our staff, which have to be considered and treated, and you know, in every decision you have to consider what the long-term outcomes are for them. Your clients, same thing, your clients and partners and teaming partners and all that sort of thing. But the company needs its own constituency. It should also, when you're considering things, you can consider what would happen from each of those perspectives. So I think that's very important when you're looking at the sale, or looking at basically any major decision in the company, to think of that as a separate thing, that it's not just your job, but it is actually sort of an entity unto itself.
So Marilyn, what are you up to now? Obviously you're consulting still.
Yeah, just a little bit. And then I went on to start a little food-related treat business called Plaid Alchemy. And I've been enjoying that a lot. It's sort of personalized, customized, meaningful treats for events and nonprofit events and that sort of thing. So I'm enjoying that. Enjoying my experimenting. Moved my experimenting from the environmental lab into my kitchen.
Your kitchen lab, absolutely.
My kitchen lab.
Well, Marilyn, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you being willing to share your story. I know many women and men will watch this and learn a lot from you. So it's really, really helpful.
I hope so. Don't make any of the mistakes I made.
Doesn't sound like you made many mistakes, my dear. It sounds like you had a well-oiled machine, and you.
Oh, no, not at all. Not at all.
It's interesting. After our interview, Marilyn said something that was really important. So I certainly want to bring that to this conversation, which was letting her employees know early on what was happening, that she was looking to sell the business. And the challenge that created was because the timeline in this sale was quite long. If you remember, CEO left, then new CEO, due diligence all over again, all of that. That created a lot of uncertainty for her employees, which is certainly understandable. Think about when you announce this to your employees, and perhaps maybe keep it a little closer to the vest until you are sure that this is going to go through. That's a tricky balance for sure. So grateful for her time. She's an incredible entrepreneur, really an icon here in San Diego. And I just want to say, so humble. All these women that I've interviewed for this series are just so incredibly humble, and so much wisdom to share. So I am grateful for Marilyn's time, and I am grateful for your time in watching this.